Welcome to the Subverse. I'm your host, Susan Mathews. This is a podcast where we journey from the cosmic to the quantum, from forest soundscapes to fragile oceans, from the songs of whales and trees to the secret world of microspecies and microbes. In this episode, I continue my conversation with my guest, Mădălina Diaconu, who researches at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Vienna, Austria. Mădălina does research, amongst other subjects, in environmental aesthetics, urban aesthetics, and phenomenology of perception. This is part 2 of our conversation where we look at her book, Aesthetics of Weather, published in 2024. Please listen to part 1 of this conversation, which sets the backdrop for the rest. In this part, we begin with tornadoes. As Mădălina writes, the medium of air sometimes draws figures, as if nature displayed a will to form. Tornadoes have often been studied by those in atmospheric sciences, but they don't often draw the attention of phenomenologists and aestheticians. As tornadoes prove, air can definitely make itself felt, even if it is invisible. Powerful air vortices affect other objects, as if they were solid substances. They hinder movement and can even sweep heavy objects in all directions. Tornadoes attest to how the air takes shape and articulates configurations. Other figures of air, for example clouds, also have texture and surface. A storm, which is a phenomenon of the atmosphere, is simultaneously the medium of air and its figure. Also, as Tim Ingold writes, we feel the wind without being touched by it. In Mădălina's book, it is noted that tornadoes are a borderline experience and fascinate us due to their tremendous power, rarity, and suddenness. While most air currents are visible only indirectly by their moving of objects, tornadoes are figures of air movement itself. The strange beauty that is born of an interplay of contingency and complexity is at the same time a figure of chaos and a destructive form force, creating its own anti-world. The atmospheric event comes to the fore. From tornadoes, we moved on to the term landscape and landscapeability. With our fixation on the solid, we render the air immaterial, forgetting the physical flows, events, and forces, including light, which make things visible. I discussed with Mădălina the question, what is a landscape after all? Why do we focus on land, forgetting the air as mere backdrop? While we do expand the term scape to cover different non-geographical and abstract contexts, including airscapes, why is there a bias towards the terrestrial? Mădălina refers to an Arctic ice cape, where the interplay of land, water, and air configures extremely dynamic, in quotes, landscapes. She explains how a landscape actually does not exist. It is constituted by a spectator who organizes it into an image, a configuration, and feels its atmosphere. A landscape is also a constellation of variously textured sensescapes, tuned with our thermic bodies as exemplified in a cityscape. In a summer in the city, one which is increasingly getting hotter, extreme weather conditions the urban infrastructure, the individual's psycho-physical conditions, and their social interactions. We find this in shielding ourselves through our clothing, modes of transportation, our architecture, and inventions, including air conditioning. Air conditioning has also increased the homogenization of natural places and indoor climates, contributing to the emergence of monolithic global cities. From multisensory landscapes and chromotopias to blandscapes and gated weather bubbles. Our conversation ended with traces. Life is transient and ephemeral, but some of our human-made waste, including our emissions, have long-lasting effects. Traces have become toxic and uncanny. It would have been better if our species could think like a cloud or a passing rain, celebrating impermanence and fleetingness. But our legacies and traces now include non-degradable waste and harmful particulate matter, microplastics, and radiation. The question now is, how can we efface our own traces out of care for the other's future? If, as Brian Thill notes, waste is every object plus time, our human imprints could be viewed of as a waste of time, a waste of the Earth's time, and the non-human kin we share this Earth with. The sky has become heavy and its weight perceivable and contaminated. The sky is falling in the form of smog, pollution, and acid rain. But there is an aesthetics of care that we can learn from through an appreciation and understanding of the aesthetics of weather. And thanks to Mădălina, she invites us to open the doors of our perception to truly atmospheric living.
I was looking for a phenomenon in which air becomes visible. And I wrote also about the wind, that we cannot represent the wind, but we can only show the effects of wind, moving branches or flags and so on. But tornado, it's a very radical example, because in that case, the air, the invisible air, makes a figure. And this figure is, we all know this from the media. I've never experienced a tornado, and I only dreamt of tornadoes, but I don't think I would like to make this experience. But nevertheless, I read accounts, experiential accounts of such experiences, and we all know these images of a column of air which is rotating at an extremely high speed. I found also descriptions of this phenomenon, or of this figure, actually, of this air that became a figure by tornado chasers. And one of them described it as a figure which is somehow perfect. It's perfect, but at the same time dangerous. And we have this ambivalence which has nothing to do really with the classical experience of beauty as harmony. So we have a form, we have a dynamic form, which at some point emerges. We have an emerging figure whose genesis you cannot control, and you cannot control its evolution, let's say, either. And the challenge for the tornado chaser is to come as close as possible to this figure of death, more or less, of pure danger, so where you have beauty and death in one. And so to come as close as possible to it, and still, of course, remain alive too, coming back to the traces, to make a testimony for the others of what someone experienced. Of course, it's a play with a fire. You can say it's some kind of game, it's some kind of a ritual of initiation, but it's more than that. It's not only some kind of adrenaline kick, but it's a very special also aesthetic perception. And I was looking also for the proper philosophical aesthetic theory to give account for this experience. And then the French phenomenologist, I think, was the most suitable for the tornado, was Michel Dufresne, who wrote about the poetic, but the poetic in the meaning of poiesis, of producing something, of generating something, because this is precisely what happens in the case of the tornado. So you cannot see anything, or you can see clouds, and clouds are also figures of the sky. We are not allowed to ignore it. So we have also everyday figures of the sky, or we have, of course, the rainbow, and we have the lightning, and also other weather phenomena, which, of course, we see. So they are figures. But as I said, this is a radical case also because it's uncontrollable. And because I think this is also a very deep, profound dimension of our enjoying the weather, or enjoying special weather conditions. You know you cannot control it. And this is not something you can, how do you call this? You can domesticate, cannot use it, you cannot manipulate it. And this is, of course, some kind of challenge, because we live in the Anthropocene. I don't think I have to explain this. And we like to think that we can control, we can manage everything. And look, this is a case in which we can be warned of coming tornado, but we cannot control it and we cannot master it. That's why we have this ambivalent experience to want this encounter and to fear this encounter at the same time.
Wonderful. In fact, I love this quote where Hepburn says it is both genesis of form and apocalypse of all other forms within a very short time. A finger that suddenly stretches out from the fist of heaven towards the earth, touches it for a short time, and then just as mysteriously withdraws again into the invisibility of the medium.
Yes, and what we can do regarding imagination is to, once again, to try to domesticate this uncanny phenomenon. by finding analogies. So if we try to describe, of course, if we are witnesses of such a phenomenon, we try to describe it. So I was looking at historical representations of tornadoes and also at historical descriptions of tornadoes. And they are compared with the column of smoke, column of fire. This is precisely what Aristotle once again said about imagination. We try to find common figures for something which is uncommon. In doing so, we try to appropriate, we try to domesticate, to have the illusion that we can do something with it, we can control it up to a certain point. And of course, this is a figure which is different if you look at it from outside or if you are within this turbulence. So we have many distinctions which we have to consider when we speak about the tornado. And I have to say that I had my reasons for a bad consciousness in writing about tornadoes, because you can say, okay, it's very easy to assign an aesthetic quality to a tornado if one didn't have the experience, the practical experience of this fright and of the losses, even human losses in this tornado. What can be said anyway is there is some kind of fascination with this phenomenon. And that from a philosophical point of view or from an aesthetic point of view, aesthetic in the meaning of theory of perception, that there is a really interesting case. Once one does not confine aesthetic experience to pleasure.
Thank you so much for this and for talking about the loss and damage that comes to people as a result of this. So what does the tornado tell us about the materiality of air? Is the air material?
The air is, of course, material. Our problem is that we assimilate it or we equate it with solid matter, with the ground, with the soil. But water is also matter and light is also matter. Electromagnetic waves and so on, they are also matter. But I think we have to expand also our concept of matter on electricity, magnetism, and even radiation and other phenomena. Although they are not perceivable in the same way as the solid ground is. But yes, you can touch the air. You can be touched by air. You can be permeated by air when you breathe. So you're also touched by air when you breathe. And this is not only about reconceptualizing matter or expanding this concept of matter, but also of assigning an active dimension to matter. So matter is not something purely passive which we can modulate as we wish. And this was also a very traditional representation of matter. Matter is something passive, and it is the human artist who shapes this passive matter. Already artists during the past centuries, even Michelangelo, for example, wrote that block of marble tells you somehow or suggests you what to do from it. So there are some kind of affordances, some kind of invitations of matter to do something out of it. And in the case of air or electricity, or what about biological phenomena? So not only weather or physical phenomena, what about a virus? A virus which is not even a living being and still, produce the whole turmoil on the whole planet. So these are forms of matter and they do something with us. Yes. So, and this has, of course, implications again on a philosophical theory of subject, which means that we are not the only creature, we are not the only form of matter who can be assigned activity or agency. And this brings me then to Bruno Latour with this distinction between agents, human agents, and actants. And the actants can be material. That can be a virus, and can be a tornado, which is actant. An actant does something with us. And in this case, the subject, the human subject, is, let's say, more reactive. So has to react to something. To react to something which is contingent, uncontrollable, irrational.
In your book, you speak about landscapes or landscapeability. And you've already talked about how we tend to favor the solid and solidity. So waterscapes without land in sight or airscapes without land in water, like those that are seen from a place, are less prone to be considered landscapes. Yet, as you mention in the book, all you need is some turbulence in a flight for this notion to be shaken up. So as you ask in the book, can airflows build a landscape?
And this is a very interesting question. I've never asked myself before. Let me return to etymologies in English and also in German. So one uses the concept of landscape, Landschaft. In German, it's even more difficult to give up this land, because in English you say also roofscapes, skyscapes, waterscapes, moodscapes, so you can eliminate this particle of land. In German, you cannot say Stadt, Landschaft for cityscape. You still use this land. And I was also thinking of the origin of the aesthetics of the environment of landscape painting. What can we find in landscape painting? Usually we have land, and of course we have also a sky over this land. But why do we call landscape and not land and airscape, this image that we see? Or even if we have oceanic or maritime, so aquatic landscapes, they are still called landscapes. And you can say, okay, it's a convention, it's a pure convention, but I just wanted to ask whether there is some kind of underlying assumption for using these concepts. And I think that this is something we do in our everyday life, that when we think of matter and, of course, landscape, this must be solid. And that's why in purely phenomenological meta, I was looking for radical cases. So I was trying to practice this eidetic variation to vary the possibilities and look for the most unusual possibilities. And one of them, or some of them, were the landscape during a thick fog, where you cannot see anything. So what can you see? It's something which is blurring, which enters your body, and this is this thick air, thick moisture also, and air. Seeing or looking at a landscape from a plane during the night where you cannot have any light, any cityscape, any lights, but you cannot see anything. So it's pure darkness, what you can see. Where is the landscape? Has it disappeared? And are we thinking of the landscape in such a situation as absent? Absent means I know it's there, but I cannot perceive it. But I know it's there. And only this knowledge that it's there makes me still feel not really uncanny, but at home. I'm really still at home on the earth. And a different landscape was by historic reports about an Arctic expedition from the 19th century. And I found there beautiful descriptions, but also terrifying descriptions of the experience of the polar winter. And in the polar winter, they could not see anything. They were trapped in ice, and they could only hear the moving ice. And of course, they were afraid because they were trapped in ice. They were afraid that these moving, huge ice blocks might shatter, might destroy their ship. But also during the summer, when you navigate on the Arctic Sea, on the ice sea, you have only air and water as elements. You don't have land. I mean, depending, of course, on your position on the map. And even if you see icebergs, you call them berg, which means mountain, ice mountains, but they are made from ice. So their matter is purely ice, even they have only the form of a mountain. So the question is, what happens with this landscape? And I introduced this concept of landscapeability, which is difficult to translate into other languages, including German. Landscapeability, which means the physical assumptions, the physical presuppositions for configuring something which we are prone to describe or to characterize as landscape. It's a very difficult definition, but let me try to explain it. So, in the phenomenology of landscape, we are accustomed with this theory that you don't have a landscape, but you constitute a landscape, which means, of course, something objective is outside there, but it's not an image. You constitute, as an active subject, you constitute this composition. And of course, you convey meaning, value, including emotional value or sentimental value, being or feeling somehow close to a place, or through patriotism, or through other feelings of topophilia. And stressing the physical assumptions of the constitution of a landscape, I wanted somehow to counterbalance this subjectivism. So I don't say that the landscape is really there for each of us, for each animal species, for non-living species, for non-subjects as well. It's not there. It has to be constituted. But we have to become aware of the kind of junction between subjective and objective factors. And I think that we constitute differently a landscape if the objective factors are different, which means in different climates on different places of the Earth. And it's well known that the theory of landscape, including landscape painting, we say in our aesthetic theory, the concept of landscape emerged in Italy and then Central Europe. So Bruegel and Germany, these were the first representations of a landscape. And maybe this has implications also for our theory of landscapes. That's why I learned a lot also for my other projects from the anthropology of the senses, from cultural anthropology. Because I was asking myself, how is it in other cultures with a different vegetation, with different climate, with a different language? Would we have the same theory of landscape or not? And I think not. And I think we are simply arrogant to say this is the only theory of landscape. But we have to modulate it, and to modulate it also according to different cultural, but also different natural characteristics. So I don't think that the landscape is the same when you are in Amazonian forest. Where can you see the landscape? What kind of landscape? You don't have this principle of the panoramic view, which is an inheritance of the Italian Renaissance painting. So it defines a certain kind of landscape or physical landscape, which you don't have in other parts of the globe.
Thank you so much, Mădălina. I want to speak about another scape, which is the cityscape. You've devoted a chapter to this, and the term that you use is the weather worlds of urban bodies. Can you speak about how a cityscape bounces off and is determined by an airscape? You've already spoken a little bit about it earlier, but if you could talk a little bit more about how weather in the city and weather in our bodies are implicated.
So for the first time, I was interested in temperature in urban spaces when I was working on tactile aesthetics of cityscapes. And on that occasion, I compared the city with an epidermis, so with the skin. And you don't only glide across the skin, but this space is also three-dimensional. And which means that the space is both horizontal and vertical. And of course, in the case of a vertical space, you have also differences of temperature. But also on the horizontal level, precisely, we had very torrid summers, so during the last years. And you can feel different temperatures in the city. Of course, if you pay attention to it, and especially if it's very hot or very cold. So meanwhile, there is a topic which interests also urban planning and also geographers. I know that for München, there is a map, a thermic map, so with a microclimate. So I try to use this concept of microclimates also for the cities. And we have different kinds of settings. So even when I come home, these days are hot again, and I enter our building and I enter our apartment, and I can find shadow, so it's a different light, and it's also a different temperature. And important for us is, I think, to pay attention, to realize that a city is not a monolith. We have a single name for a city, then we have different districts. But in the case of the microclimates, we cannot even equate or identify a microclimate with a district. We don't have any names for it, but we make their experience. So if you want to skate even during summer in Vienna, where I'm located, you can do it, although it's summer. So it's common sense that you have to assume that there is a different microclimate there. Or glass houses, where you can cultivate tomatoes very early, before the climate, the temperature outside allows you. And it's, of course, conquest, performance of civilization. So we're not allowed to forget it that we don't have any landscape, any thermic, monotonous landscape in thermic respects. We have different qualities, which are the result of civilization. But civilization has also another aspect. Civilization produced landscapes during the past 100 years because of the invention of the air conditioned. So previously it was so that when a community, when a group of people decided to found a city, had to consider the position, the geology, of course, the sources of life near to water, for example, the vegetation of the place, but also of the climate, of course. And meanwhile, as far as I know, a whole Chinese city is built somewhere in the desert. And this is possible, of course, because of civilization, because of technological development. Or the Southeastern Asian countries could develop the economy precisely because local population could overcome the thermic obstacles. So we change landscape, not only landscape, we change also the climate, but in this case we change the inner climate, which means the microclimate indoors. And what does this mean this means that in the civilized world, we simply circulate from an air-conditioned space to another. But I suppose this has also implications for our health, for our endurance, for our well-being, that maybe we become more and more sensible to big extremes. I don't know, but I think we have to reflect on it. So it's not only about cities, it's about civilization, it's about technology as such. And once again, we can use metaphors, this image of burning, of the burning planet because of climate change. I think this question is not only for philosophers, but it's also for architects, for urban planners, how to cope, how to mitigate the consequences of climate change. And if the solution is really to build more capsules for us, to focus on technology in order to survive. I don't personally think this is the solution, because I don't think this is a democratic solution. I don't think this is a solution for the entire world. And it's only making things worse. It's somehow aggravating what we have already produced. And I don't know how many people and how many living beings, including animals and including plants, you can save in these bubbles. So I'm not an adept in a bubble.
Thank you so much for saying this. It really struck me that in these kinds of economies, it's also a question of class and wealth. So people who can afford to be indoors, while you will have people who will have to work outside, either in construction or in delivery and other professions, people who are agricultural laborers. And we find this in India also, that there are lines of class and caste. And of course, there are different hierarchies in different places. And this will become even more aggravated also.
Yes, precisely. It's also a question of developing strategies of common survival. It's impossible to survive by oneself. To say, okay, I have the most sophisticated technology and me and my family. I mean, the atmosphere belongs to the commons. And I think that, as you see, that, let's say, the aesthetics of weather, it sounds very harmless. Say, all right, it's about enjoying sunny weather and blue sky thinking. It's not about this. Of course, there is also a hedonistic dimension of that, but it has so many implications, including for the aesthetics of science, including for social aesthetics and political aesthetics. So weather is something which we share and which concerns us all. Even if when we appreciate the best weather conditions, some may say, I love sunny weather, and another person might say, I love rain. Of course, but this does not mean that there are not urgencies, that we don't have priorities which are more than aesthetic, which are trans-aesthetic. But we as aestheticians, I think we are not allowed to simply close our eyes. So in front of these challenges, we have to react to them and somehow, as far as we can, maybe even if this contribution is a very small one, but somehow we have to support environmental ethics and a sound climate policy.
We're coming now to the last question. And this is coming back to traces, because you mentioned traces earlier on in our conversation. And here I'd like to ask, how do you define traces? And traces in the air in particular, in the atmosphere? And how does this also connect with concepts like impermanence, transience, and the stickiness of human waste, including atmospheric waste?
The definition of trace is not really easy. Trace is a kind of sign, but it would be inappropriate to reduce it to its meaning. Because when you say sign, you think of a trace of an animal, let's say, which passed by, and then you say, okay, this is a trace of certain animals, which means that you have a relationship between the trace and the object, in this case, the living being, which left this trace. So the trace has to be left by someone or by something. And it's, as I said before, it's a special kind of sign because it's not an iconic sign. It's some kind of, previously I used for body odors, I used the concept of olfactory signature. It's a kind of signature. My signature does not show the other how am I looking, if I have brown hair or blue eyes or whatever. So it's some kind of signature. And I think the trace is also a kind of signature. And what we are not allowed to forget is the trace is material. So you can use a trace when chasing an animal for finding the carrier of the trace. But the concept of trace was reinterpreted in the phenomenology of the 20th century, for example, by Ricoeur, by saying that in the case of the trace, we don't have the pure presence of the thing. We have some kind of remainder, not really ruin, it's not a cultural ruin, but a remainder, something which belonged to, let's say, to the animal or to that person, but it's not that person anymore. It was left behind. And maybe the carrier of the trace is even dead by now or whatever. So regarding traces, they are at the same time present and suggesting an absence. So they are at the same time in the present when we see them, because usually we see traces, but they suggest a past which is irretrievable. We cannot retrieve this past anymore. So the animal was there, but won't come back anymore. Or a dead individual, you can still feel maybe his or her odors in his or her clothes, but it's passé, as the Frenchman says, so it's over. And still it's a kind of survival. So you have this ambivalence of being there and not being there, being extremely ephemeral. You cannot embrace the person which leaves only a trace. You cannot embrace a trace. And still, some traces are more enduring, are more durable than a person's life. So it's some kind of sentimental, emotional connecting the present with the past or connecting people. So traces are not only olfactory, but they are physical. And this is what the phenomenology of traces somehow ignored. So focusing on this temporal dimension, present and past, and on its interpretation, so we can reconstruct the past, for example, the historical past, according to documents, which are also traces. So it was a kind of hermeneutics, a kind of semantic theory. But what about waste? Because in the case of waste, this is clear, a trace of our activities, of our productive activities, but waste is not wanted. So unlike cultural ruins and cultural relics or religious relics and all kinds of cultural traces, we, or the producer of the trace, didn't want to leave something forever, to live forever through his or her traces. But these are unwanted traces, and not only that, in the case of at least some categories, kinds of waste, they are uncontrollable. So when the whole planet is overwhelmed by waste, and not only the planet, but when we even leave waste in space, in the atmosphere, cosmic waste, and there are lots of technical discussions about removing this waste. So what is waste from a philosophical perspective? How are we supposed to define waste? Is it a thing? It's a nothing? And I think it's neither nor. I mean, you cannot say it's a thing or it's a thing up to a certain point. So as long as you can recognize, I don't know, a puppet which was thrown away by a girl or a technological device, as long as you can recognize the form and the meaning, which means the function, okay, you may say it's a former thing. And then, because the matter is active, so the waste is converted, or if you can speak of grades, of a gradual process of becoming waste. What you have at the end of it, in the case of biodegradable resources, you have again land, yes, which does not resemble with the beginning of the whole process of becoming waste. Or you can say, in the case of a fragrance or of a smell, you cannot feel it anymore. It simply disappears, nothing. In the case of the waste, you have some kind of in-between categories. And another aspect is with the indestructible waste. So with the radioactive or with the atomic waste. You can try to hid it somewhere. You can try to warn other people, and warn other people does not mean your contemporaries or does not mean future generations, but means that you have to warn people who might speak other languages, who might have other cultures, who might not understand our science. So in this case, waste is a trace, but it's not a sign, it's a hidden sign. And people who encounter it won't see this sign, but are supposed to see only the signs we left in order to warn them, these signs. So it's a little bit complicated, but the question is, what are we supposed to do with it? How are we going to reflect on it? And the age of overflowing waste is the age of post-hermeneutics, in which you think, no matter what I'm trying to do and how rational my intentions and how good my intentions are, at the end of the day, I cannot avoid producing waste, and I cannot avoid producing, including indestructible waste. So it's a very sad situation in which we have to acknowledge the limits of our power and of our agency as human beings, and also as rational human beings. More than that, there are no borders for the circulation of waste. And that's why our thinking in terms of national containers is completely false. We need global solutions, including for waste. And there was another thing I wanted to say regarding contamination or radiation. Precisely because you cannot feel it consciously, this shows also a limit of our intentionality. This shows that we are vulnerable subjects. And this shows also actually the limits of the traditional aesthetics, including the aesthetics of the so-called atmosphere as ambience, which is something which you can perceive in situ, so in a certain place at a certain moment, because there is some kind of uncanny aesthetics of the unperceivable. And this is the ghost. It's the undead. It's neither living nor dead, or dead and buried, not affecting anymore, but still affecting, having some kind of own will, and you have to react with it. This explains also the fascination with the uncanny. It's interesting, it's an interesting subject, but not a subject to live with, let's say.
Thank you so much, Mădălina. If there's anything that you feel that you would like to pass on as a final message?
Maybe I would end with an urge to pay attention to the things that surround us. Even in the everyday life, there are so many things which have not been discussed also philosophically or from other perspectives so far. And it's worth meditating or reflecting on them, including weather or including the disruption of seasons and so many other topics. Thank you very much for the invitation to this discussion.
Thanks to Mădălina Diaconu for sharing her thoughts with us. The Subverse is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. You can follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine. The Subverse is produced for us by Tushar Das. A special thank you to Julian Way, who helped me record at Kumquat Studio, and Daniel Schwenger for helping organize this. So long, and thanks for listening.